Power Platform practice. We have offices literally around the world, and a lot of engagements with different types of clients, anywhere from finance to healthcare to large, medium, small size, you name it. I'm also an enterprise architect, so I really look at the entire Microsoft 365 stack. But the major focus is on Power Platform and then related services like SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, some Azure. So basically that whole story. I'm a 5-time Microsoft MVP in the business applications area. I love to give sessions like this one. I like to blog a lot when I have time. Also, I authored a book a couple of years ago on Agile Office 365. So anybody who's in the project management space and in the Microsoft 365 space, you might want to check that out. My contact information, feel free to reach out. I know this is usually a very short time we have to connect with each other. If this was in person, I'd love to always catch up afterwards. But unfortunately, today it's still virtual. So feel free to ping me by email, LinkedIn, Twitter, any way you want. All right, so what are we going to talk about today?
Neil,
yes.
I think when I presented, I may have stopped your slide deck, so you may have to re-present too.
Oh, okay. Good call out. Can you see
That's perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm not going to reintroduce myself. I'm just going to leave it on there for 1 second. But my last slide has the same information, so I don't have to. You don't have to worry about it if you don't get the information right now. And also, if you want, somebody can just type the information right into the chat, or I can do so also at the end of the session. So, what are we going to talk about today? First thing is talking about what's inside of the toolkit, the Power Platform. So just a brief overview. Some of you might be very seasoned Power Platform users. Some of you may be fairly new and are just interested to learn about it. So I always like to give people the benefit of the doubt. We'll talk about the component licensing. So looking at each one of the applications, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agent, some different add-ons, and looking at how you license those. Then we'll talk about limits and capacity. So what happens when you reach a limit? Does everything stop working? Does it break down? Do you get some nasty messages? And then looking at how you actually extend your capacity if you need to. And then the last one I want to talk about is a really, really important topic. It's called multiplexing. And that is really a way for you to understand, are you doing the right thing? Are you licensed properly for what it is that you're doing? And if not, what are the implications? Okay, so let's look inside of the toolkit. So the Power Platform is essentially composed of 7 different components. We've got Power BI, which is kind of, some people include it, some people don't. I do like to include it, even though the licensing is just touched on very briefly. But the Power BI allows you to do some analytics. We've got the Power Apps, which is your essentially the human interface, your apps that you're building, whether for mobile or for integrated into Teams or SharePoint. You've got Power Automate, which is your workflow workhorse. It does all of the computations, etc. Power Virtual Agent, that is your chatbot that you can build with no code very quickly. And then a layer underneath, we have Dataverse, which is a cloud-based database that also has a lot of security built in, logic built in, and it also is built on the Common Data Model. AI Builder, which does some additional computations on behalf of the user, and data connectors. And that is really what allows you to connect to different data services. So let's look at a slightly deeper look of each. So Power Apps, there's 2 versions of Power Apps available to you. Actually 3 versions. There's a Canvas app, which is like a Pinterest canvas. You can make them look any way that you want, rich in color, imagery, videos. If you're working in a mobile device, you can actually leverage your GPS and your camera and all different components. So it's really, really powerful in that respect. They're built mobile first. So when you're actually going and building a Canvas app, you can say, I want to go with a mobile design, and everything is nicely laid out. And you can build your applications literally with no code very, very quickly. There's a lot of templates available to you that you can start building your apps from, so you don't have to start from scratch. Then we have model-driven apps. So remember a moment ago I mentioned Dataverse as a data source. And so with model-driven apps, it literally looks at your data model and Dataverse and says, okay, I'm going to present that data. It's more of a, how should I say, traditional boxes and field type design, although today you can actually customize that as well. And then the third one is the Power Apps portal. And in simplest terms, think of the Power Apps portal as just a website. But the data that you're adding to the website from the backend is coming through Dataverse. So you have that added benefit of the low-code implementation. You can then use CSS and JavaScript to then enhance your website. And it's all nicely integrated into the Power Platform. Pardon my voice, I'm actually just coming over a cold, so I may not sound very clear. The next one we have is Power Automate. So Power Automate, there's two versions of it. You have what is called Power Automate Cloud and Power Automate Desktop. The Power Automate Cloud are cloud-based workflows. They're running inside of your Microsoft 365 tenant. You can have different types of triggers, whether it's timer-based or if somebody presses a button, let's say inside of a Power App or a physical button, those type of physical triggers. Or you can have it also automatically launch a workflow based on an action. If, let's say, somebody drops a file into a OneDrive, you receive an email. Somebody enters a new entry into Salesforce. So you're not limited with the Power Platform. You're not limited to the Microsoft ecosystem. There's a lot of connectors that allow you to go beyond, and that's one of the beauties of it. You can build templates, and there's thousands of templates available today for common tasks that companies perform. So if you wanted to go and build some automation, you could start from scratch, or you can actually go to the template library and just search it and say, oh, you know what, I found something that does about 90% of what I need. Let me download that template, and I'm actually going to modify to my specific needs. So again, just another way of saving you a lot of time. So that is all the Power Automate Cloud. Power Automate Desktop is an RPA solution, RPA, robotic process automation. The idea behind RPA, it's supposed to mimic user interactions, which means replacing you at the keyboard and at the mouse. So if you're working with old legacy systems, sometimes green screens or other types of applications that don't have a modern interface, don't have a way to interact with them, no APIs, what do? You don't necessarily have to say, okay, we can't automate it. You can. And the answer to that question is RPA. So you can actually train an RPA bot to launch an application and go through a specific sequence of keystrokes and mouse actions to complete a task that a user would be doing. Would you do it for every simple task? No. But if there's batch processing that needs to happen, or tasks that take a long time or are done on a very frequent basis, those are the type of tasks that you'd want to have a bot execute on your behalf. And there's two versions of the bot available. You can have what is called an attended bot, which literally means it's running on your machine. It needs to log in as you or as the user, perform the actions. And then you have an unattended bot, and it can run in a virtual machine on its own, not interrupting anybody. So that is what Power Automate is in a nutshell. Then we have Power BI. So as I mentioned before, it allows you to do very deep analytics of your data. It really tells you the meaning about the data. It's not just here's a bunch of numbers, but what does it really mean? What is the implication? And one of the things that I love the most about Power BI is it has natural language understanding. So you can actually train Power BI to understand the data. And then if you start to ask a question such as, what was the weather in Toronto 2 years ago in April? If the actual data points are available, Power BI can understand what you're asking it, and it can actually bring that information back to you. So it's really powerful in that respect. And you can mash, you can bring in and mash together data from hundreds of data sources. As long as there's a way for you to relate the data, then you can then represent it in a very rich form to the users. Power Virtual Agent, it's a chatbot that is created from essentially a library of topics and then answers. What's really nice about it, you can actually point a Power Virtual Agent when you're building it to a website that has questions and answers. It can actually scan that site and build a list of all these topics for you. So rather than having to type in the information, you can already start with the bot within minutes that would have all these questions. And then you can give it certain rules. If, if else, or if there's a choice, you say, you ask the user age range, and then based on the age range, it would give you a different answer. What's also really nice about the Power Virtual Agents is that they can interface with Power Automate. So remember a moment ago I said about Power Automate having the ability to connect to all these services. Well, a chatbot can actually make a call to Power Automate, pass it some information from the user, and then Power Automate can go out and get, process all this data, come back, and then present the result back to the user and continue from that point. So imagine if you're asking it to find out information about an invoice. What's the state of it? Has it been paid? So this is where the virtual agent can call and Automate. Automate can go to your CRM, look at the invoice information, then bring back the result, and then surface it directly in the chatbot. Very seamless. Dataverse. So again, Dataverse is a cloud-based database. It is leveraging the common data model. For those who don't know what the common data model is, there's a consortium of companies, Microsoft, Adobe, and a few more, and they're looking at what is the most common type of data that is used in organizations today. And they combine this information together, and then what they do is they make it available to users of Dataverse to basically say, okay, this is what you can use as a starting point, but then you can also expand on it. You can build your own entities, you can add your logic. It has a lot of security built in, and it interfaces really well with the Power Platform. And actually, for those who don't know, the Dataverse is actually the building blocks of Dynamics 365 and the applications. AI Builder. So this allows you to take your workflows and your Power Apps to the next level. So rather than having to look at an invoice and then read out, for example, different numbers or scan different numbers, AI Builder can do that for you. There's predefined models to scan an entity and let you understand what it is you're looking at. So if you're trying to understand the language of an email that comes in, are you trying to understand their sentiment? Is the person happy or frustrated just based on reading the email? It can be looking at an object like you're looking at the screen right now, where I've got gray cans and green cans. It can actually distinguish between them. You can do predictions. So based on historical data, you give it some other information, it can predict what will be the outcome. So there's all these artificial intelligence models that you can then build and have them leveraged by your Power Automate or your Power Apps. And then we have the data connectors. This is a very rich ecosystem. It says 350, it's probably closer to 500 today, of connectors that you can use inside of your Power Apps, your Power Automate, through the desktop and through Power Virtual Agent, and all of those, you can leverage those connectors to read data, view data, manipulate that information and send it out. And so that's why I said before, you're not limited to Microsoft. You can actually make Power Platform your central system for doing business processing. And it can just easily interface with all these different systems and do the work for you. Questions about the Power Platform before we continue to the next section? Anything, Tim?
I don't see anything at the moment, no.
Okay, so let's keep going then. So component licensing. So what I want to do now is I want to start looking at the different services and looking at what kind of licensing we're looking at. What you see on the screen is US-based costs. I actually don't generally like to put the numbers there just because I may have clients from different regions. And so the numbers may confuse. For example, I'm based in Canada, so my numbers are actually higher. They're still dollars, but they're Canadian dollars. So it looks a bit weird. But this is supposed to give you a really high-level overview of kind of the different components you have to think about when it comes to licensing. Okay, if it looks overwhelming, it can be. But what I'm hoping is that through the session today, I can at least open your eyes and make you understand that there's kind of a methodical way to think about how to think about the licensing or how to determine what it is you actually need. Now, before we start talking about the different licenses, I want to call out one thing inside of the Power Platform service. By default, users can buy their own licenses. That's something that if you have a new tenant set up or if it was never configured, you can have any user just go and start buying their own licenses. While it might sound like not a big deal, think about it this way. If you work for IT, you might have somebody who's building an app that requires premium licensing. They start buying licenses. And now what they're doing is they're starting to share the app with other users. And so those users are saying, oh, it's telling me I need to buy a license. Okay, I'm going to go and get a trial license, or I'm going to just buy some licenses for a little bit. We'll take care of it later. And before you know it, this application could become a mission critical application for your company, right? And then one day, somebody may come to IT and say, oh, by the way, we've got this, $20,000 bill. Can you please pay it? It's from all these credit cards and all these accounts. And IT might be like, wait a second, this was not in our budget. What's going on here? So a general recommendation is try to control and govern how your licenses are being created, because they're not cheap. And so the way to do that is to actually disable users from creating their own licenses, buying their own licenses. And the little PowerShell script on the screen is what allows you to do that. That's just a quick recommendation around licensing, right? They're not cheap. So two things you want to be doing. You want to be reviewing them on a regular basis. And there are actually community accounts available. So every user and a tenant can actually sign up for a community plan. And that allows them to use their own development environment, build stuff, try it out without actually impacting the organization's tenant. Okay, try to use those without using production data or production tenants. Okay, and then disable the self-service licenses, again, just so you don't run into an issue where clients come to you and say, oh, we need to get paid now. So let's start looking now. Before I jump into the specifics, I've been with the Power Platform since day one. So as an MVP, I had privileged access to beta releases and try it out, experiment with it. And it was really promising from day one. Yes, it was more limited, but it was promising. But one thing that drove a lot of people to the Power Platform is that it was free. You could just do anything you wanted without paying a penny, right? A lot of automation. And then if you can compare that to other third-party companies that are out there, it was a slam dunk, right? Why would I pay for another service if I have this thing coming from Microsoft for free? And then over time, Microsoft started adding licensing, premium connectors, different types of tiers, some of the other services like Dataverse, which became a paid-only model. And now some people say, well, hold on a second, it's not free anymore. Why would I use it? So rather than thinking about cost or no cost, think about the amount of time that you're saving versus having an individual or multiple individuals performing these manual tasks. So if you think about it that way, any batch process or anything that is done manually will probably take you, at the very least minutes. So think about doing an approval of a travel request. So in many cases, what you have to do is you have to go fill out a form, and then you have to email it to somebody manually, and then the manager has to approve it, and then they have to physically email it back, and then they have to take that copy, send it to HR, and then stick the document right into a system, right? So you get multiple people touching this whole process and having to do a certain tasks. By automating it, the approval still needs to happen, but it could be a single mouse click, and then everything just happens on the back end automatically. So you're saving yourself a lot of time there. And so that's something I want you to keep in mind is when you start thinking, when you start hearing me talk about, you need a premium license for this, or you need a license for that. Don't think about it from a point of view of, well, I don't want to use it because it's expensive. Think about it that it's an investment because Microsoft needs to run the servers and they need to do all these things. But what am I gaining from it? And by the way, I don't work for Microsoft. I gain nothing by Microsoft getting more licenses. I don't even get licenses myself. So, all right. So let's start looking at the different services. So the first one is Power App. So as I said before, there's 3 different flavors of it, or 3 different types. There's the model and the Canvas app, and the Power App portal. And there's different flavors of licensing for them. Anybody who's licensed for Office 365, whether it's E3 or E5, you have like an academic license or a government license, you can start using the Power Platform. You can start building Power Apps right away. In fact, you can build an unlimited number of Power Apps, but there's some limitations. You're only working in the default environment at first, unless you get additional environments access. You can build workflows, but those workflows will be using only your standard connectors, which is something that is a limitation for the Office 365. So the typical standard connectors are what's available in Office 365. So Outlook, OneDrive, SharePoint, the Office 365 users to look up information from them, and a few more. And that's really what the standard connectors are. So they're great for getting you started and for some personal productivity and simplifying some of your work, but they're not intended to be kind of the mainstream workflows or applications that are going to be used for the entire organization. You get no Dataverse for that. You get no AI credits. And Power Virtual Agents, you can build them as part of an actual team. And we can talk about that in a little bit. So that is the simplest tier. It doesn't cost you anything extra. It's really included in your Office 365. The next one is what is called a Power App per app license. That means that if somebody builds an app and you want to get access to that specific app, you can buy a Power App per app license. It then gets assigned to that app, and then you can access that specific app. If there's 2 apps you want, you can buy 2 of those licenses, and that's what's called stackable. So you can buy 2 different Power Apps per app license, use them together for 2 different apps, or if you have the same app in a development environment, in a production environment, you need separate licenses. So this is how you can use the Power Apps per app license. Side note, once you get to the 4 app level and more, you might as well switch to the Power App per user because that's going to be cheaper for you. In terms of the connectors, you can use any connector that's available, whether it's on-premise, custom, premium, standard, they're all available to you. Workflows. So Power App can call a workflow, as I mentioned before. And you can run these kind of workflows as long as the connections and everything you're doing are within the context of the app. If that doesn't make sense to you, I'm going to get to that in a little bit, so please hold off. With every Power App per app license, you also get additional database capacity for Dataverse, so 50 megabytes per user, and 400 megabytes of file capacity. There's a 10 gigabyte capacity that comes when you set up a tenant. That's a default. And then you just start using that capacity, and for every additional user, you get more capacity. AI Builder credits. So we'll talk about those credits in a little bit. You get 250 credits per month for free. And then, as I said before, you pay for every app. If you build a model-driven app and you embed a Canvas app inside of it, that embedded Canvas app does not require a separate license. That's already included in the model-driven app that's hosting it. Okay. So the next one is the Power App pay-as-you-go license. So this is a fairly new one. Some of you may not be familiar with it. It's very similar to the Power Apps per app license, and you can see in terms of the access is pretty much all the same. The Dataverse capacity is more. The big differentiator is the cost of it is more than the Power Apps per app license. However, you only pay if you open up an app at least once a month. If you don't open up at all in a month, you don't pay a penny for it. If you open it up 1 million times in a month, you pay the same amount of it, which in the US, I think it's $10 a month. That's the cost for it. So if you're building an app, let's say for the entire organization, and there's something that they only have to use, let's say for year end to do reviews, employee reviews. So it may be only like the month of December where you see everybody using it, but after that, it goes back to 0 for everybody. And then the last tier for Power App is the Power App per user license. And that essentially is the Cadillac. It gives you access to any app in any environment with all the different connectors. Again, with the Power Automate, it depends on the context. And then you get more credits for AI Builder, and you also get more capacity for Dataverse. So this is the Power App licensing for Canvas and for Model. With Power Apps portals, as I said before, think of it as a website with Dataverse in the backend. So you can pull data and display it. You don't have to, you can use it without any data, but then what's the point? You might as well just use a regular website. But if you want to interface with Dataverse and you want to expose it to the world, this is how you do it. Now, with the Power Apps portal, there's essentially two things you want to consider. You can have anonymous logins, and this is basically anybody just wants to see public pages without any data with no authentication, and that's 100,000 page views per month. For sessions, for authenticated sessions, you can have external users and internal users, and it's basically based on the domain. If you're an external domain or you're not a contractor, you consider an external user. Every time you log in, a 24-hour session, login session is considered one. So if an external user logs in 3 times a day, that's considered one session. If they log in one time and then it extends over 24 hours, that then becomes 2 sessions or 3 or however long they stay logged in for. And then for internal users, it's based on the Power Apps license. So you need to have a Power App license to do that. Next one I want to talk about is Power Automate. So here we have 4 different flavors. The first, and you'll see some of them are similar to what we saw with Power Apps. So Power Automate per user. What that means is they can use as many workflows in as many environments. They can use all the connectors, they do not have access to the desktop flows. We'll talk about that in a second. They get additional Dataverse capacity, but no AI credits. So that's the Power Automate per user. The Power Automate per flow. Flow is the old name for Power Automate, so they call each workflow a flow. That's the term. So you can buy that per specific flow. However, you need to buy a minimum of 5. So in other words, if you want to set up certain workflows that are going to be running for the entire company, you need to buy at least 5 of those licenses. That's the minimum. Again, it's when you give the licenses, it's per flow and it's per environment. So if the same workflow is running in different environments, you need to have separate licenses. You get access to all the connectors, no Dataverse, no AI Builder, no desktop flow, but you do get some Dataverse capacity. And then the next one we have is Power Automate user with attended RPA. So it's the same as the Power Automate, except that it gives you access to one desktop flow. Remember I talked about the RPA before? And then it also gives you access to AI Builder credits because they sometimes work together. So you're building your AI, like sophisticated workflows, so it gives you some credits there. Now, Power Automate per flow and Power Automate per user with attended RPA. When you build those workflows, or when you have those licenses, the workflows that you're building can call another workflow, and they're called child workflows. And so when you do the per flow license, you have to think about, is it going to cost extra? Like if I have a child flow, do I keep everything in a single flow? So we'll talk about those ones in the next slide, the child flows. And then we have the unattended RPA, and that is it's not really a workflow. It's really just an RPA license. And that is intended to run a bot on its own, unattended, in an environment. And it actually sits on top of the Power Automate user with attended RPA license, or just the regular Power Automate per flow plan. So that's an add-on. Now, when we talk about a top flow versus a child flow, what does it mean? So in Power Platform, you can build your applications and your workflows, and you can package them into something called a solution. Now, if you're using solutions, you can build a workflow, which can then call another workflow. And you can build those secondary workflows as what are called child workflows. That's only available in solutions. And the way that you would call them is there's an action called run a child workflow. The trigger for a child workflow, interestingly enough, is the instant trigger. Manually run a workflow. It's the same trigger. So that's how you set it up in a solution. And when you do it that way, your child workflows don't require an additional license if you have the Power Automate per flow license. So you'd only have to pay one license for the flow here. Now, if you don't use solutions, or if for whatever reason you decide to use a different mechanism for calling a flow from a flow using the HTTP connector, every one of those is a top flow, so every one of those would have to be licensed separately. So on the left-hand side, I would need one Power Automate per flow license. On the right-hand side, I would need 3. Now, I talked a moment ago about Power Apps, calling Power Automate, and the context. Okay, so what they're saying is that you can the Power Apps standalone license. They require different license for the RPA. But one thing that's important to consider here is if a flow is running on its own. So let's say you build a Power App and you want to have another workflow running behind the scene on its own. That secondary workflow is not considered as part of your Power App license. You need to have a different license. The other thing, and this is always a tricky one. Suppose you're building a Power App that needs to access SQL data, and you want to use a Power Automate flow to go fetch the data for you, maybe do some manipulation of the data, and pass it back to your Power App. So in the picture on the screen, your Power App per app or Power App per user license would cover this specific scenario. Now, suppose you wanted to have the workflow not just service the SQL, but also while it's doing that, it's going to go and do some processing for Salesforce, right? So let's say in my Power App, I'm getting some information from SQL, and I'll say I'm going to do an update. The workflow does the update to SQL, but then it also does an update to Salesforce. In this case, because Power Apps has nothing to do with Salesforce, now you need a separate Power App license and a separate Power Automate license. So again, those could be per user or per app or per flow, but they have to be separate licenses that you need, so 2 of them. How do you get around it? If there's any context within your app for Salesforce, you're covered. In other words, if you don't want to buy that Power Automate per flow license or Power Automate per user license, just put some awareness of Salesforce. Even if it's a button that says go and update Salesforce, or it passes back some information, now your app itself has that context of Salesforce, so now you're covered. So now your Power Apps per user license or Power Apps per app license is good enough for this whole workflow. Next one we have is Power BI. So here we have basically 3 types of almost 2.5. There's the Power BI Pro, which comes with Microsoft 365 E5. It's included. If it's in with E3, then you can add it. I think for the US it's about $10 a month. It's per user. You are limited to a 1 GB model size, and you can do your refreshes up to 8 times a day. And then you have a maximum storage of 10 GB. So in many cases, that is enough. If you're doing some heavy-duty Power BI work, you might want to look at the premium licenses. This is also per user. And you can see how it increases your model size from 1 GB to 100. It can increase the number of refreshes of your Power BI dashboards from 8 to 48. And you've got a lot more data availability, 100 terabytes. And then the biggest one is the Power BI Premium per capacity. This is for the enterprise. So this one has a few thousand dollars per month sticker tag on it. But it is meant to run for your whole organization. So if you have some on-premise reporting you need to do, heavy duty processing of data, large amounts, model sizes up to 400 gigabyte, that's which one we're looking at. Okay. Next one is we have the Power Virtual Agent. So again, two flavors of it. The Power Virtual Agent on the left the side of the table, this is where it's running on its own. It's not running inside of a team. It's running as inside of a website. You can have up to 2,000 sessions per month included in the monthly license. Your session durations are up to 60 minutes or 100 turns, and a turn is every time there's a question, answer. That's called a turn. So you can have up to 100 of those. You can access Power Automate. Again, think about the context. All the different connectors are available to you, and it also gives you Dataverse capacity because the Power Virtual Agent actually is managed and stored inside of Dataverse. If you're actually building a Dataverse for teams and you're building a Power Virtual Agent inside of a team, it's a very different mechanism. You're leveraging the Dataverse within the team, so you're limited to 1 million rows. It doesn't have a separate cost to it, but it is also more limited. You can only use the standard connectors. You can't access any data from outside of the team. And you can only users from the team can access that chatbot. Now, there's another license you need. It's called the Power Virtual Agent User License. So there's no cost associated with it, but you actually need to get those licenses for your users. That's just a way of saying, if I want somebody to not build a Power Virtual Agent in my tenant, I'm just not going to give them a license. That's why we need to do that. Now, the second comment here, and this is general for most things, there are limits. And now Microsoft does not enforce the limit in most cases. So if a company happens to go a little bit over occasionally, not a big deal. If companies start going over on a regular basis, and they go over by a lot, then they need to have a conversation with Microsoft to true up to what they should be actually using in terms of their capacity. In extreme cases, Microsoft can actually throttle or create denial of service where basically the service will become unavailable to the company. Now let's look at some add-ons. Actually, let me stop before that. Any questions about the general licenses, Tim?
I don't see anything, just a little bit of conversation. That's about it.
Okay. I hope that everything is crystal clear, or just not that I'm completely losing people. Awesome. Okay, so Dataverse. So with Dataverse, this is where, again, it's like a database. So you get 10 gigabytes out of the box when you set up your tenant. For every paid Power Platform license, you get some additional capacity. There may be times where that may not be enough. Maybe it's a small company of 100 people, and even if they all have Power Platform licenses, they may be very heavy users of Dataverse. And so this is where they may have to look at buying additional database, file, and log capacity. There are three different components. So the database capacity, that is literally just your tables inside of your Dataverse. That is what the database capacity is. File capacity is if you're storing files inside of Dataverse. So that is a different type of capacity. Personal opinion, if you're doing a lot of file storage, you're better off to store it in SharePoint, and the two work really nicely together. Would be better than actually just sticking them into Dataverse. It's also cheaper to go the SharePoint route for file management. And then log capacity. So you can set up logging per record, per column. You can get very detailed or very high level. It really depends on your specific needs. Obviously, the more logging you do, the more logging capacity you need. So you can buy more of that capacity. There's also ways to do cleanup. So let's say if you want to keep your logs only for a certain amount of time, you can then purge them and then not have to buy extra capacity for logging. So again, this is something that you probably want to determine together with the business users and the architects on what's the best way to achieve that. AI Builder. So you get 1 million monthly service credits. You buy that in a package of 1 million credits. Before you get too excited about 1 million being like, oh my God, I can run 1 million AI builder sessions, this is really great. It's not exactly like that, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then Power Virtual Agent. So you buy 1,000 sessions, but then you can always buy additional sessions if you need to. Now let's look at some, actually just realized my slides are out of order. That capacity was supposed to come later, but that's okay. So requests and limits. So the requests and limits is just to ensure that because we're all in a shared environment, that there's going to be one specific organization that's kind of chewing up all the CPU cycles for everybody else. And so that's why limits are instituted. Limits are pooled by paid users. In other words, let's say if every user gets 1,000 cycles per day, and there's 10 users, then you get 10,000 cycles per day. Simple as that. Over averages, again, depends on how much the overage is. If it's small, may not be a big deal. If it's a large overage, you may get throttled. Now, what is an actual an action that you need to think about, or a request? Every time you trigger a workflow, anytime you call an action in a workflow, and the action doesn't have to be an action that does something complex. Even like an HTTP action, initializing variables, right? You make things like, it's not actually processing anything outside. It's inside of the workflow. It still counts as an action. Creating scopes. So for those who build Power Automate workflows, they like to organize everything nicely into scopes. Every scope counts as an action. Compose. All of those, everything is a workflow in your workflows are counting as actions. If you have loops, every iteration, every action will count towards it. So you may have one action, but it's performed 1,000 times. That's 1,000 requests that you're making right there. Expressions are not counted as requests. So this is where you want to think about, you can think about, okay, maybe I'm using 3 different actions that I could actually compose into a single expression. So this is just maybe one way for you to cut down. I'm not suggesting right now to go and rewrite all of your workflows into massive expressions. It's not what I'm saying. But there may be some opportunities if you have some workflows that are running at a really, really high rate, where you have some actions in it that you may want to eliminate, like the scope, or if you're just setting some data for intermediate results or something, there may be a better way to do it or a more efficient way to do it. Actions, whether they fail or whether they succeed, they count as part of your requests. The only time they don't count is, imagine you have an if-else statement in your workflow and you go down one branch, anything in the other branch that was not actually executed does not count. And then if you go and if you actually try to rerun a workflow that failed, or even if it worked and you rerun it, those ones would count as well as actions.
Real quick, we do have one question from the chat here. Brandon asks, he says, I worked with a Microsoft rep recently, and I was told that on the new data capacity model, log storage was stored in Azure Blob, thus not being counted towards Dataverse storage. Is that not true?
That no, that would be true. So the information that I'm giving here is, I don't want to say that it's dated, but there's still ability to do logging. And if you go into the admin center, you'll still see the logging listed there. So some of the documentation may not be 100%, and sometimes the information that Microsoft will give is something that they're just rolling out. So if that's what Microsoft told you, then go by what they're telling you.
And Chris followed up with a slightly unrelated question, but so if you have a loop that runs 100 times, it counts as 100 flow actions?
No, if so, you would have one action, which is basically the loop itself, right? So for 1 to 100, that action itself is one action. If inside the loop you have 5 actions, right? Retrieve a SharePoint list, update the SharePoint list, send an email, do something else, 4 actions. If that runs 100 times, that's 400 actions right there.
Thank you.
Okay. Good questions. All right. So here are some examples of the request limits we have. So for Power Apps licensing, mostly it's about 40,000 requests per day, per 24 hours. And it includes a number of the licenses. This is just, don't try to memorize this or it's just to give you a general example of what it is you're doing. And even Power App itself also makes calls when it's running. So that's also something to consider if it's connected to data sources. So those are the general limits available. So for Power Automate, you can see in the middle of the screen, you've got 250,000 requests per day if you have any of the premium licenses, and that gets pooled. So there's a lot of capacity available once you start having more of these paid licenses. What happens is, and I see this sometimes, where clients are avoiding at all costs to have paid licenses, and then they start saying, "Oh, my workflows are getting throttled." I'm like, "Yes, because you don't have a lot of capacity, and you choose to go down a route which is not the preferred way." Okay. So again, that's just an example of the different types of limits available. In terms of add-ons, so as I said before, Dataverse, you can add additional capacity. Power Apps and Power Automate, if you find that you need more capacity to run more apps and more flows, then if you're a company that is just very heavily using it, you can buy additional capacity. Power Virtual Agent, as I said, the Teams version does not have a limit, but if you're working with Power Virtual Agent on its own in a website, then it's a 2,000 sessions per month. You can increase it to more. And I think it's 1,000 sessions, the additional that you buy. And then for guest users, you'd have to get Azure B2B or B2C licensing. So they essentially have to have a license to use your Power Platform in your tenants. And then for E3, if you want to do some more advanced logging, so by default, there's some logging available in Power Platform in the security and compliance center. But if you want to do some more advanced logging, then you can look at either E5 or additional licensing as part of Office 365 to then allow you to do some logging there. Power Apps portal. So we talked about that one, and we said there's either number of login sessions per month or 100,000 page views, 100 pages or 100,000 page views. Well, what if you need more? So there's actually tiers that are available for the portal, and depending on how many tiers, how many expected sessions you have or how many you're buying, you can actually ask your rep or whoever sells the licenses to look at a different tier. So if I know that I'm only going to be having 100 login sessions a month or 200 or 300, then I'm going to go with tier 1. But if I have a minimum of 1,000 sessions a month, I'm going to switch over to tier 2 because it's going to cost less money. And likewise, if I go over 5,000 sessions a month, a lot of activity, if I do some sort of a sales front or something, and I'm getting a lot of sessions every month, then you might want to look at tier 3. So you're going to be getting at the minimum 5,000 sessions. But then if you need, let's say, 5,500 sessions, then you would buy 55 units of a tier 3, and that would cover you. And again, minor overages, not a big deal. If you're going over by a lot, then you want to watch out for that. Okay. AI Builder add-ons. So I said before that by default you buy 1,000,000 credits. And 1,000,000 sounds like a heck of a lot. Well, nothing costs you 1 credit. So there's a lot of different models. This is just a sample of the models. I didn't put all of them. There's more in there, but just to give you an example. So business card reader, there's a pre-built model in AI Builder where you can just scan a business card and it's going to extract all the information. So you don't need to train it, you don't need to build it, you can just start using it. Every time you use it, that's 100 credits. Okay, so you can only scan 1,000 business cards in a month, not 1,000,000. If you want to do form processing, so this is commonly done, for example, if you have not just invoices, but I was doing a project for a real estate company, and they had contracts, standard contracts that they needed to scan in and process. So the training is fine. The training is free. But then the contracts that are like 5 or 6 pages long, 500 credits per page. So all of a sudden, the 1,000,000 is really represented by, let's say, 5 pages, which is going to be 2,500 credits for a single contract. So that brings it down to 400, if the math is correct, 400 contracts, and you're done for the month. So you may need to get more credits. And then again, just more examples. So they're not all the same, depending on the complexity of the computation and the type of data. Some of them are by page, some of them are by picture, some of them are by character, like translation. So just one thing that you want to keep in mind here is that that's how the credits are consumed, and there's ways to see online, what is your burn rate. Questions about add-ons and limits?
Do you have another one from Chris here? It's kind of not on add-on limits, but so if you have a loop that runs 100 times, it counts as 100 flow actions?
I think I might have answered that before. So you got to count every action inside of your loop. So if your loop inside has 4 actions and the loop runs 100 times, it's going to count as 400 actions.
Okay. And additionally, Brandon has a question. This might be somewhat related. So we are operating utilizing 1 per user Power App license as a service account. Am I understanding correctly that if we exceeded 40,000 requests per day, it would result in a denial of service? How do requests differ from actions? And is there a way in the Power App Admin Center to monitor requests per day?
Okay, so 3 parts to the question. First of all, it would be a Power Automate. Like if it's workflows, it should be a Power Automate license per user or per user, not per app per user. Just to clarify. So can you repeat the sections of just go section by section on the question because of 3 parts? The first part, what was that?
So it says if we are operating utilizing 1 per user Power App license as a service account.
Yeah.
That's says, am I understanding correctly that if we exceed 40,000 requests per day, it will result in a denial of service?
No. So again, if you're going a little bit over, and I don't have a clear number on what a little bit means, but if occasionally you go over a little bit, it's not an issue. If you start to go over every month and you start exceeding it in a significant amount, then you may start to get throttled. The denial of service is if you're really exceeding it by a lot and you're essentially abusing the system, that's when you may get denial of service. Microsoft, as far as I've never ever seen in all my years that I worked on our platform, not once have I ever had a denial of service. I've had times where I got throttled, and that's because I created a workflow that just went on an infinite loop, and was spawning different workflows that was like it was just going crazy. So it was throttling me, but I never had a denial of service. So I wouldn't worry about that. Again, if you're building something that's going to run, and you know for a fact it's going to run a lot more than the 40,000 per month, then you should consider increasing your capacity. Okay. And again, you mentioned Power App, so I just want to clarify: are you using a Power App license or are you using a Power Automate per user license?
Brandon, feel free to come off mute.
Yeah.
It's a Power App per user.
Okay. So I'll talk about that in a minute, because typically if you're running workflows, and is it like a service account that kind of running behind the scene?
Correct.
Okay. So hold that thought, and I'll get to that in a minute. So what was the second part of the question? So besides the 40,000, there were 2 more things in that question, Brandon or Tim.
So he was also wondering how requests differ from actions.
It's the same thing. A request is an action. Every action is essentially, think of it as like an HTTP call that's being made. It's a request. So everything that you do inside of Power Automate is a request. Every box you're putting on the screen, every trigger and every action is a request.
And then additionally, is there a way in the Power App Admin Center to monitor requests / actions per day?
Yeah, you can actually go into the Power Platform. It's not in the Power App and it's not in the Power Automate. It's in the Power. So all the admin, there used to be different admin consoles for every applications. They've all been consolidated into the Power Platform admin console. And there's a way to actually look at the number of actions that are being consumed. Side note, and actually, if you're interested, I should suggest you join my session later today. There's something called the Power Platform Center of Excellence. And that is an application that it's a free application that can get installed in your tenant, and it helps you monitor the usage. It helps you do a lot of monitoring and helps you support your governance. So that is one thing also you can actually drill down into specific workflows or specific apps to find out all the details about it. So that's something else you might want to think about. So let's talk about the next section, which is multiplexing. And I should be able to answer your question around the service account. And if not, then feel free to come off YouTube. We can discuss it. So what is multiplexing? So in a non-Microsoft way, but basically using hardware or software to try to pool connections or reroute information, to access information, reduce the number of licenses. In other words, you don't want to pay for your license and you're trying to find a sophisticated way around it. So the reality is Power Platform was not built to prevent you from avoiding the licenses. It was never built that way. If they really wanted to, they could have put up some very serious guardrails, and then your hands would be tied. You wouldn't be able to do much. That was never the intention. Microsoft licensing is about, a lot of it is about, I don't want to say trust, but intended use. So let's look at the example here. So user one is accessing data in Dataverse, and he's licensed with a Dynamics 365 license. Great. That user then exports data from Dynamics and emails it to user two. User two views the data, maybe does some update, and then emails it back to user one, and user one then imports data back into the system. Now, user two is not licensed, and that's okay, because there's never an instance in this scenario where user two interacts with Dataverse. The chain of automation is broken. So that's why this is not considered multiplexing. Now, let's look at the next scenario. If user one does the same thing, they work with Dataverse, they send data by email to user two. Very good so far. Now, let's say through Power App or some other automation, user two invokes a change in Dataverse, whether it's direct or indirect. User two is now automatically impacting Dataverse. Therefore, user two must be licensed. If not, you are multiplexing. Okay, you're avoiding the license for user two. Another common scenario, and I see this all the time. So user two is unlicensed, or they just have a regular Office 365 license, and they want to store data in Dataverse, but they really don't want the license. So what they do is they say, okay, I'm going to be really smart about this one. I'm going to build a Power App that is going to write data to SharePoint, and then I'm going to have a service account. This is for you, Brandon. And the service account is going to write to Dataverse, so it's going to do something there. So two things are happening here. First of all, user two is indirectly impacting the Dataverse, so user two must be licensed. Okay. The other thing is the service account. So You cannot use a Power App per user. You can't even use a Power Automate per user license if you are running what is considered to be a service account. If you're running a process that is for a department or for a team or for the whole company to process data, then you must use a Power Automate per flow license, and you must have at least 5 of those licenses. Like I said before, that's the minimum unit that you can buy, and use those ones for your tenant. So if there's a single workflow, the one you mentioned that runs in a loop, you would need to buy a Power Automate per flow license, assign that license to, or you buy 5, take one of the 5, assign that to that workflow, and then you have another 4 licenses available for other service account type operations. I hope that answers your question about the license for the service account. Okay. That brings me pretty much to the end. I have some references here for anybody who's interested, but I'm going to open up the floor now to any questions that you have about anything we discussed today.
Feel free to drop them in the chat or just come off mute. Oh, Chris has another question here in the chat. For pay-as-you-go, does it only go by apps in that environment that requires a premium connector, or is it for any app in that environment?
So the pay-as-you-go is for a specific app. If that app has a premium connector, then sorry, let me phrase it in a different way. If an app does not have a premium connector and does not meet some of the other criteria, then you don't need to use the pay-as-you-go license. You can just use your regular Office 365 license. If it meets the conditions, in other words, it has a premium connector, it uses an on-premise gateway, or the custom connector, anything like that, that would make it a premium, then you can use the Power App pay-as-you-go license. And it is per environment. So in other words, if you have the same app running in 2 environments, then you have to have 2 pay-as-you-go licenses. But imagine you have this, and actually that's a good scenario. Suppose you have a development environment, test environment, and production environment, something I would highly recommend. You build the app in dev, and you use your Power Automate per pay-as-you-go license. And then you put it into the test, and probably use the same one, not the same license, but the same type, the Power Automate per pay-as-you-go license. And then you go to production. And there it would be either Power App per user license or Power App per app license. They're like tongue twisters, depending on the scenario. Because what's going to happen is the moment that you deploy the solution to production, now your test and your dev are dormant. So why would you be paying for licenses? And then you also don't have the headache, oh, did I turn off my license? Did I not? I have to now go monitor and go check. Just leave it as a pay-as-you-go, and you know that the only time that you're going to pay for that license is that during that period when you're testing it or when you're developing it. And after that, you're just not paying for it.
Chris had kind of a follow-up, but did that clarify, Chris? Well, additionally, okay. Somewhat.
So is there another question for that, or?
Do you have kind of a follow-up, or do you? Just wondering if you have a non-premium license apps in that tenant.
Yeah.
Or environment. Feel free to come off mute here, Chris, if you want to clarify. Okay, so saying if you have a non-premium license, apps in that tenant or environment, does that bill under pay as you go?
If you have a non-premium license, what's a non-premium license? And Chris, I think, do you mind Chris coming off mute? Maybe it's.
Yeah. So my thought is, okay, let's say I have an app that's just that access SharePoint.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't require a premium license
Mhm.
in my production environment. But
Right.
then I have another app that accesses SQL Server, which
Right.
requires the premium license.
Correct.
Now, if a user accesses the one that just accesses SharePoint but doesn't access the one that requires the SQL Server, does the Azure pay-as-you-go consider that any app I access is considered a user that accesses?
No, the pay-as-you-go is for a specific app. So if you have two apps that are premium, you would actually need to get two pay-as-you-go licenses for a user if they need to access it. But if your user only accesses the app that accesses SharePoint and they don't even have a license, or even if they have a license to the SQL, but they're not accessing it in a month, they're not paying for that.
Okay. Because from what I saw with the pay-as-you-go, you apply it to the environment. You don't apply it to the app. And so then I'm just wondering then, so it's not every app that someone accesses in that environment is going to now be considered a user under pay-as-you-go, is it?
No, and I know it was recently just or it's still in preview. I can follow up on that if you want, Chris, and I can
Sure.
let you know. But from what I know, from all the documentation I've seen, and actually the link here in the top, I suggest you view this link. It gives you all the information. A lot of what I actually discussed today is coming from that, and then some. But from what I know, it applies to a specific app, the pay-as-you-go. It's
Okay.
not by like, it's by app within a specific environment. So you have to apply it to the environment, but then you also, I believe, have to apply to the app.
Okay.
Right.
Questions? I'm curious to know how many of you are going to have to go back and say, oh no, I have all these workflows that are multiplexing and now I need to go back and re-engineer.
Well, I took a look at, while you were talking about this, my admin center, and we're not even close to the limit, so I don't think I have to worry about it in the short term at least.
Not the limit, but more the design of the architecture of the workflows, whether there's multiplexing happening. I find that most organizations I work with are inadvertently multiplexing because they just don't understand how things are licensed, and they say, well, if all I need to do is I just need to write something temporarily to SharePoint, and then I just have a simple user account, right? Use a Power Automate or a Power App, per user account, and I'm done. It works. Yeah, of course it works, but that's not how it's intended to be used.
I think a lot of this would get resolved if Microsoft would just include that in the E5 licensing like they do Power BI Pro.
Yeah, you know what? That would be immensely useful, but that could potentially price out E5 from what people would use. But think about it this way. I was going to think about that last night. In the old days, for those of us who come from SharePoint, we were spoiled. We had SharePoint Designer. We could build custom workflows, using Visual Studio, whatever tool. We had all the tools at our disposal because it was on-prem. We had the server. We could do whatever we wanted. If we wanted to go third party, we had Nintex and K2 and a number of many other companies out there. And it didn't cost us. And if you wanted to go the SharePoint Designer route, it was like a visual tool. Didn't cost us a penny. Worst case, if you wanted to use the Server 2013, I believe it was, to run the workflows that were more advanced, SharePoint Designer 2013, it would have been another box we have to run. But there was cost to it, right? There was another machine we have to support. All of that was basically whether it was included as part of the other services that IT was running, it was something else that they needed to monitor and make sure that it works fine. But now that you're moving into the cloud, it has to run somewhere. It's using some computer. Somebody has to pay for it, right? So that's where, you know, as a company, initially Microsoft said, you know, we're going to make it free, try to get as many users to get using it, and then figure out the pricing for it. And there was a lot of noise, and you know, I'm not ashamed to say I was one of those people who was kind of fighting back and resisting initially, saying, you know, how can you do this? You know, all the users started using it, and now there's a cost to it. But if you really start to think about it from a business point of view, yeah, there's a cost, but how much are you saving, right? Think about it at the end of the day, from a loss and profits, right?
Yeah,
So-
yeah, but see, that's another issue is that now that there's a cost associated, the business is going to want a cost benefit analysis.
And that's why once you start going down the route on the Power Platform, those who are just starting, who are brand new, they, you know, it feels like they're dipping their toe into ice cold water because it's a shock to them. It's like, oh, there's cost. But once they slowly start going into it, right, and your body has kind of acclimatized to the cold water and you're in there, then you realize it's actually not that bad, because once you hit the threshold that I said before, the 4 apps per user, or the once users are using more than 4 apps, that licensing, which is now $20 a person per month for US, and that's if you buy a single license. If you are buying it in volume, you should be speaking to your Microsoft reps, because I know that I have clients and they're up for a renewal cycle, and they make an agreement and they can get huge discounts sometimes because they're committing to spending the next number of years working and using the Power Platform. So they may be paying significantly less, but still reaping the same benefits.
Well, but another issue with that is usually you don't have 4 apps right off the bat that you're going to utilize the license for, and some of these apps are apps that people use maybe once, twice a year. For the majority of the users, while there's some that are using it constantly. Like for instance, we have one that's for fixed assets that I might request a new computer once a year at most, but the purchasing department will be using that app constantly. But
Right.
you know, what's the justification for me to have a license that only uses it once a year versus, you know, the purchasing department that needs it all the time?
Sure, but I mean, if you were to look at it this way, I'm sure you can find, and there's no simple math to give you the answer to that. There could be some applications or some apps that would be used by many people in the organization on a fairly regular basis. You know, any sort of cost or expense approvals, vacation approvals, things that are, HR is very manual process, and there's a lot of processing that needs to happen. IT, you know, even finance now, I'm finding that we're working with a lot of finance departments where they have to do a lot of tasks a lot of times. So you're right. You may not have 4 apps that are used across the entire organization on a regular basis. There may only be 1, but every department itself may have at least 2 to 3 other ones that they're using on a regular basis that they want to leverage, right? And so if you look at the full set, you may see like, you know, companies having hundreds of applications, and they're not all used by everybody. You know, everybody's using something else. But but definitely, I mean, it's something you want to look at is doing the cost analysis. If you're early on, you may say, okay, year 1, we're just going to go with a pay-as-you-go or the Power App per app license, and we're going to buy a whole chunk of those, use that, and then maybe year 2, once we've proven it out and we're happy with it, we're going to switch over to Power App per user if it makes sense. If we have adopted it and there's enough interest, right? So you can kind of plan it out that way. But there's really no magic bullet for that. Every company works different.
On the pay-as-you-go, can you see the users and what apps they're accessing. So you can say, oh, this person's accessing like 4 or more apps. Maybe we need to get them a the full license versus the pay as you go.
The pay as you go is actually managed through Azure. It's not managed through the Power Platform. So I'll be honest, I haven't actually seen it, but I believe in Azure, when you're looking under the Azure billing, you could get that information.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you get billed through Azure. So it has to have that indication. It would show you that, you know, Chris used this app, you know, for this month, and therefore there's a billing for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Good questions. Any other questions? Chris or anybody else? No, this is actually, believe it or not, this is the part I love most about the sessions, is actually talking through some scenarios and actually helping out. I one time had a session in New York where things really went sideways and I actually completely lost my deck. I'm like, okay, let's have an hour of you know, just free consulting. And it was amazing. It was one of the best sessions ever. So yeah.
Well, I know I had to have a personal session with Microsoft on the per app per user plan, because I didn't realize we were originally going to go that route for one of the apps, and then talking to the rep, they said that once the user signs into the app, that app license is applied to that user, and it doesn't go until they're out of Microsoft 365. So you have to buy another app license for each user that's going to access that app.
Yes, it's per user and it's per app. It's not a rolling license. Like my original thought when I heard about per app, you know, pay as you go licensing, my thought was like, every time I log on, it's 5 cents. Like, great, you know, so you only pay when you use it. But no, it's a different type of pay as you go. So, good. I'm going to switch over to my last screen, which is again my contact info in case anybody wants to stay in touch, get connected, you know, ask more questions. Always happy to discuss.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Any additional questions, guys? Well, why don't we, while we're thinking if there are any more, I'm gonna quick do the giveaway. So as you know, I mentioned that we give away a $25 gift card based on kind of participation in the conversation and whatnot, but we appreciate everybody coming. Also, if you notice in the chat, I have dropped the link to the survey, as well as dropped the link to our afternoon keynote, which you can also find on the sessions board at our website. So feel free to join us at noon with that. But in the meantime, I'm going to quick present my screen so you can see my random wheel picker. And we're going to spin the wheel. Brandon. So Brandon, if you could send me over your email or just drop it in chat so I can make sure we get that gift card to you. But thank you. And thank you very much for the presentation. It was interesting stuff. I know of the questions I get as a consultant, licensing has always been top of the list, right? So anything we can do to get clearer on that is amazing.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. I got your email there, Brandon. Appreciate it. We will get that off to you.
Thanks for all the info, guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. And we'll see any of you back here at, if you're, I believe Scott Kaiser is at the 1 o'clock spot here. So, or noon spot. So, no, it'll be 1 o'clock. I'm confused. But thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, everyone.